أهلا وسهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كان يوم أمس يوما كبيرا جدا. نحن نصور هذه الحلقة يوم الأربعاء 6 من نوفمبر في صباح اليوم التالي للانتخابات الوطنية الأميركية. بالأمس أدلى عشرات الملايين من الأميركيين بأصواتهم، وهي المرحلة الأخيرة من عمليات بدأ فيها المواطنون التصويت قبل 6 أسابيع، وقد صوت أكثر من 150 مليون شخص لمناصب تتراوح بين مجالس التعليم المحلية إلى منصب رئيس الولايات المتحدة الأميركية. ما الذي نعرفه؟ نحن نعلم أن الرئيس القادم للولايات المتحدة سيكون دونالد ترامب، وهو الشخص الثاني فقط الذي يعود إلى المكتب البيضاوي بعد خسارته حملة إعادة انتخابه. وهناك أكثر الذي نعرفه أيضا عن الحالة المزاجية للشعب الأمريكي، وعن أولويات الناخبين الأميركيين، وعن نقاط القوة والضعف في نظامنا الانتخابي. لمناقشة كل ما نعرفه وما لا نعرفه، يسعدني أن أرحب بضيوفي من الخبراء السياسيين البارزين دانيال ليبمان ونورم أورنستين وأليكس جانجيتانو. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The 2024 election is now history. This election, of course, is really the third act of a 3-act play that began in 2016, Trump versus Clinton. Then 2020, Trump versus Biden. Now, Trump versus Harris. We meet this show the morning after the vote. What do we know? What don't we know? First, the big headline. Trump sweeps the table. Norm, is that the big story of the day?
It certainly is, Rob. And sweeping the table also means, stunningly, that he won the popular vote, it appears, which is not what anybody really saw coming. Now, the polls did show it was very close, including on the popular vote, but we didn't think we would know anything by Wednesday morning or have definitive results. We certainly didn't believe that Trump, after this campaign, would sweep the table, including every one, it appears, of the battleground states, while winning the popular vote, and it appears winning a majority for Republicans in the House of Representatives and in the Senate.
All right, we're going to get into that in just a minute.
Wow.
We're going to get into that in just a minute. Alex, Let me ask you about that. First, the United States Senate, a very close, almost evenly balanced chamber. But what happened in the vote yesterday?
What happened is
Alex.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Alex.
Yeah. So right away, we're getting results that an Ohio Senate race flipped towards Republicans. That kind of quickly shifted things into looking like Republicans were going to pick up a few seats in the Senate. Now, as of Wednesday morning and late last night, Trump has a Republican Senate. What that means for him is that he can appoint cabinet members that he wants. He can get his loyalists into his administration. The balance of power here is all shifted towards Republicans. And it really was because of some key pickups for Republicans. We also, Mitch McConnell will no longer be Republican leader. So it turns into figuring out who that will be. But basically Trump now, it looks like will be able to sweep White House, Senate, and House, and the guardrails, and so to speak, that Democrats warned about him not having are definitely not there.
So Daniel Lippman, let me ask you about that third piece of this. The U.S. House of Representatives, all 435 seats were up for election. What do we know about that?
So right now, Republicans appear to be on track to keep the House, but with a pretty small margin. And so Speaker Johnson, who is a new speaker, relatively speaking, he was at the Mar-a-Lago event yesterday. Trump threw his full support behind him, so there's not going to be a shakeup. And so I think that Republican candidates in the House were able to use the same issues that powered Trump back to the White House. Immigration, the economy, kind of painting the administration as not well adept at managing those issues. And voters don't appear to care that there's not going to be a check in Congress. And so I think the check is going to be the courts are going to play a role about stopping Trump on certain issues. But he's going to have a free hand for a while. And a lot of the court members, the judges, have been appointed by Trump, and so they're less likely to stop him unless it's clearly illegal.
All right, we're going to get into some of the implications of all this in a couple of minutes, but first let's bore down a little bit into what actually happened out there across the country with yesterday's vote. Norm, Donald Trump evidently improved in almost 95% of the counties across our country. Namely, he did better in almost every small place in America than he did 4 years ago. Help explain to people around the world what happened.
He not only did better in the counties, Rob, he did better with almost every group, with the sole exception, it appears, of American Jews, who in the exit polls only gave him 22%, which is just about the range that he would have otherwise. But for example, in the state of Michigan, he won by 2-1 among Latinos. Now, that's a shock, frankly, because we thought we had an October surprise, and not one that we might have expected coming out of the Middle East. But it was the Madison Square Garden rally where many of the people who spoke at his invitation trashed Puerto Ricans and other minority groups. But it didn't seem to matter. What seems clear is two things. The first is voters just wanted a change. We went into this wondering Biden's approval rating was at a low point, at a point where in previous elections, it would seem to be a disaster for the ruling party, the party that holds the presidency. But we didn't really see signs of that given who Trump was and what he represented. But it seems clear that voters decided to roll the dice and go for change. And that was true almost across the board. The second thing that's true is the contrast between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump could not have been greater. Donald Trump didn't disguise what he would do or how he would perform. And his rallies, which seemed to have fewer people but went off on rants and tangents, were just brushed off by a lot of people. Frankly, just to finish, we thought that Trump had a floor in support of around 45 or 46%. But we thought the ceiling was more like 47 or 48%. And with our electoral college, that would have been enough to win, perhaps a narrow victory, something like he won in 2016. It turns out the ceiling was greater than that, and that it was not, in the end, even though close in popular vote, not close in terms of the Electoral College. And that's a stunning result, frankly. For those of us who followed American politics for a long time, we're going to have a lot to ponder.
So talking about a lot to ponder, Alex, Democrats must be waking up this morning more than just scratching their head, but there must be a lot of reckoning going on in Democratic circles. Was it the candidate? Was it the polling? What was it that went so off the rails?
Right. I think there's going to be a lot of finger pointing. I mean, one of them is going to be at President Biden. Should he have even announced his reelection bid in April 2023? If he hadn't, would there have been a normal Democratic primary to replace who would be, running for president? And it I think looking back, it might have not been Vice President Harris who won that primary. If it was somebody like a California Governor Gavin Newsom, could somebody like that have beaten Trump? We don't know, but I think that will be one of it. I think another finger pointing will be Harris's running mate. She chose Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. Should she have chosen Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro to help her in Pennsylvania? And another question is just the rhetoric of Democrats. They ran against Trump. Should Vice President Harris, given this short campaign, have come in and said, I'm turning the page on the issue of immigration. The Biden administration has not done well on that. We hear you on that. And I will accept that failure and do something better. Instead, she went ahead with the rhetoric that President Biden was using on the trail. And clearly people weren't happy with that. Same with the economy. Should she have gone against President Biden's rhetoric on that and, said that the administration hadn't done enough? So I think there'll definitely be a reckoning in the Democratic Party about what went wrong in terms of messaging, in terms of people. And, now that we've seen it with Clinton and Harris, in terms of, which candidates they put up.
Daniel, we used to call it the blue wall. This blue wall is now red. That is these Midwestern states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, all of whom appear to have been won by Donald Trump. Your view, how did the Democrats get this so wrong?
I think you could probably look from 20 years ago, more than 20 years, 30 years ago, with Bill Clinton signing NAFTA, which is the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico that led to thousands of factories moving to Mexico, mostly, and also later on to Asia in terms of outsourcing. And that left a lot of economic hurt among the working class in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. People who used to make stuff with their hands, they had to find new jobs that were much lower paying, much harder to get a foothold into the middle class. Now people are working for Amazon or Uber at much lower wages. And so a lot of people are worried that that their kids are going to have a less prosperous future because of how Washington has treated them and kind of forgotten their interests. And so that's what Trump tapped into in 2016. And those people felt like even if he couldn't solve everything, that he was at least listening to them and trying to work hard to address their issues. And I think what's interesting about the Biden administration, along with Harris, is that all of their laws and bills to address those working class fears about bringing back semiconductor manufacturing to America, the Inflation Reduction Act, hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies and tax credits to bring domestic solar and wind production, the infrastructure package to address America's roads and bridges, that did not pay political dividends. A lot of people did not feel it in their lives, and so they did not want to reward Harris for that. And they also had a bad first impression of the Biden-Harris administration because of the first 2 years of high inflation, which has now come down, but it didn't come down fast enough and was too high, in part because of a stimulus package that was too big at the start of the Biden administration.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about some other aspects of the election in just a moment. Again, my guests today include Alex Gangitano. Alex is a White House reporter at The Hill, where she was previously the lobbying reporter. Earlier in her career, Alex was a staff writer for CQ Roll Call, where she authored Heard on the Hill. Also with us is Daniel Lippman. Daniel covers Washington politics for Politico, and he authors the social data section of Politico's New York Playbook. Daniel previously reported for the Wall Street Journal in New York. And with us also is Norman Ornstein. Norm is Senior Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of our wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. Norm co-authored a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. Alex, there were some fears before the election about foreign governments who might try to mess around in the vote, disinformation, perhaps even hacking some of the voting systems. The vote seemed so big for Trump. Did any of that external intervention happen, or did it have any impact?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, because of how big it was for Trump, it didn't have the impact of, I think if this came down to a race on the margins, they'd be looking more at that. What was interesting is last night, though, there were some bomb threats called into some polling areas in Georgia, something like that. I think also might have impacted people not heading to the polls. But again, he just won on these high margins that I think at this point, if Democrats come out and complain about interference and whatnot, it turns into a sore loser narrative. But we'll see how they assess, how these elections turned out. But of course, Democrats went into this saying this is going to be the freest and fairest election. So they kind of set the groundwork for that, too.
And just on the similar theme, Norm, third-party candidates, people were worried that they may be spoilers. Jill Stein pulling votes, Robert F. Kennedy, whose name was still on the ballot in many places. In the end, did it have an impact?
It didn't in most places. The votes for Stein and Kennedy were mostly trace elements. But I have to tell you, in Michigan, in the city of Dearborn, where there's a very heavy Arab American population, Jill Stein got twice as many votes as Kamala Harris. She got 33% there. Overall, across the state, it didn't matter very much, but it was pretty clear that despite what Donald Trump had said about Israel, despite Bibi Netanyahu favoring him enormously, the backlash against the Biden-Harris administration mattered there. Now, in the end, if Michigan were the turning point, we might look at this more carefully. But as Alex said, and as we have all said, this was not close. So, that was not the factor. 2016, you could argue that Jill Stein made the difference and, with some help from Vladimir Putin. This time it wasn't that. It was much more.
All right, so let's take a look, Daniel, just for a minute, at any surprises that our viewers abroad might recognize or appreciate in the Senate or the House. Did any big names lose their seats in the Senate elections?
So John Tester, he's a longtime senator, at least for a couple terms, from Montana, a farmer who's actually a seven-fingered farmer because he had some accidents as a couple decades ago, and so he is a working class person, and he lost to Tim Sheehy in that state, who's a Republican. In Pennsylvania, which was very important for the presidency, it looks like Dave McCormick, a Republican who ran for the seat ran for a Senate seat from that state in 2022, looks like he's going to beat Bob Casey, who is a member of a Pennsylvania political dynasty. He is McCormick is a former hedge fund executive, seen as more of a moderate Republican. But still was able to help Trump in terms of being on his side for this election. He broke the coattails of Trump in that state. And we're looking at Michigan, which is still a tight race, but Alyssa Slotkin, it looks like she's going to win. She's a Democrat. But Sherrod Brown, he was the senator for Democrats from Ohio, seen as a longtime working class champion. He went down as well to a former car salesman named Bernie Moreno.
So in the end, Trump had coattails, Norm. Is that reasonable to say?
Yeah, and it may even be worse than that for Democrats. We still have a couple of races out west. Jackie Rosen in Nevada, Ruben Gallego, the Democrat in Arizona. There's something to be said about this, though, Rob. Some of these Republican candidates had serious issues. Tim Sheehy in Montana was caught lying about an injury from a shooting that he said happened in combat, and it turns out that was false. Became a big issue towards the end of the campaign, but it didn't matter to voters, as it turns out. We're in a tribal world now. And in Arizona, it would be pretty shocking because the Republican candidate, Kari Lake, is an election denier, pretty radical, who had been rejected before. But it seems very clear that voters have just decided that they want a change, and they're not looking at the qualities of the candidates nearly as much as they are at deciding that the party in power, even if the Republicans have had a majority in the House, that Donald Trump, even with his baggage, they wanted to sweep a lot of ins out and bring outs in. And now I have to tell you, if you look at the Senate map for 2026, the Democrats' hopes, assuming we have a midterm election, are pretty dim. There are many more Republicans up. This time, the Democrats had a problem because there were twice as many Democrats up and some vulnerable ones, some we didn't think were quite as vulnerable. Next time, the Republican seats are mostly pretty safe. And so if Republicans end up with 53 or 54 or even 55 seats in the Senate, it is extremely unlikely that they will lose that in 2026. And so we could have 4 years of Republicans basically having a free hand to do almost anything that they want. And we know what the agenda for Donald Trump and his party happens to be.
So when we look at the next 2 months, 2.5 months, we have this unique period here in American constitutional life, a transition, a very long transition from one administration to the other. Joe Biden remains the president until the third week of January. What can we expect, Alex, from Joe Biden and from Donald Trump during this period?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, it will be a pretty fair and reasonable transition, just considering that Joe Biden was on the other side just 4 years ago, and the Democrats complained about how, rightly so, how the Trump team did not cooperate with the transition. So I do think there'll be a lot of cooperation with the transition. I also think Joe Biden, on a personal level, I mean, this is a reckoning of him and his presidency. I think what he has left in terms of trying to preserve his legacy. I think we're going to see him try to, end this war in the Middle East. We're going to see him continue his support for Ukraine as much as he can, especially before a Republican Congress comes in and maybe aid is threatened there. I think in terms of what we'll see from Trump right away, I think later this month, we're going to see a whole list of cabinet hopefuls, people that he wants to put in, Wall Street types coming in as Treasury Secretary. We'll see if the promise for RFK Jr. to get Health and Human Services actually comes to fruition. And, if Elon Musk gets a role, all these kinds of people, we're going to see those names trickle in a few weeks. And then in terms of, Harris, I think this is largely the end of her political career. She'll be moving out of the observatory and working on a J.D. Vance vice presidency to come in that transition.
So we'll keep our eye on that issue. Thank you, Norm. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us the morning after the stunning vote, the return to the White House of Donald J. Trump. Thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بنظام الانتخابات الفريد في أمريكا، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج InsideWashington أو مباشرة على @RobSatloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.